Frank, welcome to the Dare to Know podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Arjan. I'm very happy to be here.
Yes, great to have you here. So now, before we dive in, let me just briefly note for the listeners and viewers that Frank is also my PhD supervisor. So I'm really excited to have you here for today's discussion.
Yeah, this is a very new setup for us, but I'm very happy.
Great. So today we'll be discussing your recently published book titled The Structure of the Open Society, Social Ontology Meets Collective Ethics. So I just seen also that you actually have the book in physical copy, so perhaps you can hold it up. Yep, there it is.
Right there.
Great.
Yeah, it's been available online already for a couple of months, and they told me the physical copy would be printed on the 3rd of December, but somehow a few weeks earlier I already got it.
Right in time for the podcast, so that's great.
Yeah.
So Frank, let's begin. So why should we care about the open society as a philosophical idea?
Yeah, so a lot of philosophers embrace liberal democracy as an ideal for society, and so do I. So you could think the open society is redundant if you have this notion of liberal democracy, which focuses on equality, on freedom, in my version also on autonomy. And we already, since John Rawls' theory of justice, we have a very good conception of what that could be. Of course, there's many alternatives and many improvements and all that. But indeed, why the open society? Well, that has become increasingly clear, I believe, in the past couple of decades. Because it turns out that just having liberal structures in a society isn't enough for maintaining a liberal society. And for instance, a constitution that guarantees our liberties, our basic liberties, that's a wonderful thing. However, what you see in some countries is people flout these liberties, and the people in power. And slowly but surely you see processes like within a society, polarization and fragmentation. People who've first thought or identified with society or a country as a whole no longer do so. They have more local identifications, and they become less and less liberal. So polarization comes in practice with less support for liberal institutions. Now, the good old idea that we have since John Rawls is that these liberal institutions will protect us from, for instance, democratic backsliding. And what we see now is that it's not enough. And my claim in the book is that on top of the liberal society, we need to expand it, so to say, into an open society in order to make liberal democracy sufficiently robust to the challenges that we see nowadays.
Great. So we'll definitely unpack this idea of the open society more in the rest of this talk. But before we do so, let me turn to the subtitle of your book, which is Social Ontology Meets Collective Ethics. So what are we to make of that?
Yeah, so social ontology is about society, and collective ethics is, among other things, about the open society. So in that sense, it's closely related to the main title, but it also provides another angle on the book as a whole, because the structure of the open society is really meant to indicate what the book is about. It's about social structures like institutions and organizations, and it's about the open society, a liberal democracy that is protected by what I call the open mentality, which I will unpack later, I expect. But social ontology meets collective ethics is really an indication for other philosophers who want to read the book. Like the basis is in social ontology, so that's the philosophy of society, including the metaphysics of social phenomena. And I've worked in that area, it's a subdiscipline of philosophy, for a long time. But throughout the years, I've become more sensitive to the fact that we need to make this relevant to other disciplines. And in particular, we need to make it relevant to normative topics like rights and responsibilities, freedom. So that's where collective ethics comes in. So collective ethics is the ethics of collective phenomena, like the social structures that I talk about, or the social groups, or the social identities that we adopt within a society. So it's really me expanding my ideas about social ontology and make them relevant to collective ethics.
Right. And so when we turn to the field of subfield of social ontology, so here you propose that we should rethink the notion of ontological holism when we want to think about the open society. So here we have a core metaphysical idea, ontological holism. So how could that actually help with trying to make sense of the idea of an open society?
Yeah, so that is that requires some background. So I need to say a bit about how Karl Popper worked with the notion of an open society. He really put it on the map. He was not the first to invent it, but he became famous for it after the Second World War with his book *The Open Society and Its Enemies*. Now, you could have thought that the enemies of the open society was like Hitler and Mussolini. They undermined it in practice. But in his book, the enemies are philosophers, Plato and Hegel in particular, and a bunch of others, but these are the main enemies. Now, what Popper argues is that philosophers like Plato and Hegel portray society as a whole, as an organism almost, and within that whole, within a society, individuals have to find their place. And like Plato was talking about, kind of a natural order in a society where certain people have certain roles, and because of that, they are subservient to other people. Like a soldier will be subservient to a general. Now, that kind of picture of a society where people have a stable role to play and are not to question the overall order of a society is what Popper regarded as an organic or a holist philosophy. Now, let's set apart the question whether Plato and Hegel really defended that. Yeah, that's very controversial. But Popper's enemy was really holism. But what did he mean by holism? Organicism. And this idea that, as he formulates it, the tribe is everything and the individual is nothing. And that is the idea that he attacks. And along with that, if you read him now, you might think, oh, so we should still refrain from defending holism because it comes with this danger that individuality is lost. Now, I disagree.
Mhm.
So I have developed a kind of holism that doesn't have these problems that Popper identifies. I'm not the first to do that. I should emphasize. Many other holists, holism has become more popular in the past couple of decades. So the idea is that social structures like social practices and institutions cannot be reduced to individual agents and their actions. And that has been defended very well by several philosophers, but I develop it here in particular in the context of this notion of an open society. I argue against Popper that this implies that a holist society has to be a closed society. And they use some insights from metaphysics in order to explicate the relation between a society and individual agents in terms of constitution. So yeah, I think there's lots of new ideas, but it already fits with a development that we've seen since Popper, that holism need not be equated with organicism.
Right. And so when we take a step back now and we start to think about the building blocks of society, so this is also where you start to spell out your account. And so people before you have tried to point to either rules or equilibria as potential building blocks of thinking about society, but you actually managed to combine them into a single framework. So
Yeah.
how do you do that?
Yeah. That is not an easy question, and it took me a long time to do this. I actually spent some time already during my PhD period as a PhD student working on this, and ever since. Because if you look in economics, lots of theories characterize institutions as equilibria. So the claim is that an institution is a regularity in behavior that is stable because of the expectations and the preferences that people have. They are self-reinforcing, and that I always thought is a nice, crispy, clear conception of an institution. Now, many people criticize it because it's based on rational choice theory, which is not accepted by everybody. And then there are really a lot of different theories that conceptualize institutions in terms of rules. And here you can think of theories in sociology. Anthony Giddens is famous for it. But also of theories within philosophy. Wittgenstein and on rule following is perhaps the most famous example. And lots of philosophers and social scientists have picked up on this and developed that. Now, in the case of equilibria theories, it's clear what they do. It's all about the incentives that people have and about how that explains behavior and how that explains why that behavior is reinforced over time. With rule theories, yeah, they have many different roles to play. So some focus on how our behaviors acquire meaning. Others focus on the definition of institutional terms. Yet others focus on how rules play a role in our cognitive, in the way we think about our own behavior when we interact with other people. So it's less clear. It's a very rich terrain, so to say. It's not a criticism of rule theories, of course, but it is kind of daunting when you start thinking about it. So if you then want to combine them, yeah, what are you doing? How are you going to combine them? Is it even possible to combine them? Now, here I started thinking about how even equilibria can be conceived of in terms of rules. Not technically within the theories themselves, but if you think about it, they concern a specific situation in which it is rational to perform a particular kind of behavior, depending on preferences and expectations, given the assumption that agents maximize utility. Now, the situation and the behavior can be kept recast in terms of a rule. So if you are in that situation, well, it's rational to perform that behavior. And you can also add it. You should behave in that way, and then you are already quite close to the notion of a rule. But yeah, lots of people will still say, yeah, but it doesn't really add anything, and that's one of the important things when you try to integrate theories. Yeah, just to show that they are consistent is one thing, but that's boring. That's not good enough to convince people to adopt a hybrid theory. And then I started working together with Francesco Guala, and we introduced this. We combined it with the notion of a correlated equilibrium, which and we started working on the notion of a signaling rule. Or so the idea is that rules in that trigger an equilibrium can play a signaling role. For instance, in traffic, when traffic lights literally signal what you are to do. And from that point onwards, we looked at coordination institutions where signals can help people converge on a particular kind of behavior, like driving on the right-hand side of the road or wearing wedding rings as a sign of being married. And then I realized, well, there's this entire kind of institution that is out of the picture yet, that isn't part of our theory, And those are cooperation institutions, the ones that explain why and how we cooperate and how we bridge certain conflicts of interests. So then I started looking more closely into the normative dimension of rules, which is important in many rule theories of institutions. And on the one hand, it was already right there. As I mentioned, you can reformulate the rule in terms of in normative terms easily. If you're in a particular situation, then you ought to do such and such. However, it again, you need to ask what more is required, and then you need to look at for examples. For instance, a famous harvesting example where a neighbor helps the other neighbor who has a farm to harvest the crop. Yeah, what incentive does the other have to reciprocate? And for me here, the key thing to look into is the legitimacy of the norm. So social scientists have done a lot to explain why people conform to norms, and in terms of sanctions or in terms of a warm glow that people feel when they comply. But for me as a philosopher, it was really important to look into the normativity of these norms and see how they how that might actually also motivate people. So I developed that idea, but yeah, I hope this provides a clear enough answer to your question. It has been a whole entire development. I started from Equilibria theories, thinking, well, maybe something is missing, and then you cannot include just any ideas from rule theories, let alone all. That becomes way too messy. But I looked at the explanatory need that I felt and how that could be filled.
Right. No, so thanks a lot for putting that hybrid theory on the table. So that's very clear. So now, earlier you already mentioned that you're interested in the idea of holism and how to go beyond Popper in terms of holism that is acceptable. So now we can maybe start to spell out your form of holism that might do this kind of work, and that might also underpin your ideas about how this hybrid theory can actually be used to explain social practices, social groups, and social structures. And so your idea specifically is constitution holism. So perhaps you could outline how that metaphysical idea can help here.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so holism is the idea that social phenomena cannot be reduced to individual phenomena or social facts to individual facts, however you formulate it. And constitution is the dependence relation that I postulate between the social and the individual. So let me say a bit more. As many philosophers are a bit afraid to embrace the term holism nowadays. So what you see is that people come up with other terms like, what is this term? Like in the philosophy of mind, there's material individualism, and I'm trying to remember. I blank on the
Is it like
term.
the idea from like List and Speak was like the individual supervenience? Was it?
Well, that's the idea indeed, but
Okay.
yeah. So they say, well, look, the social supervenes on the individual, and that provides constraints on any kind of theory for the social, which makes such theories acceptable. But they still use the term individualism. And I started out saying, well, I agree with supervenience, but all that rules out is very extreme forms of holism, the ones that postulate zeitgeist maybe or whatnot, like strong forms of emergence. But it still leaves open lots of other kinds of holism. And by using the term individualism for their view, they detract from that. So it seems to me that that they accept some kind of non-reductive view of social phenomena, but they still want to call it individualism in order that maybe, I don't know why, but maybe to not scare off other people,
Mhm.
because holism seems so mysterious. to many people. No, I thought, yeah, but that's intellectually not the best way of going about, at least not for me. So holism is, I really use that term in order to indicate, look, the social phenomena cannot be reduced to individuals and their actions. And we need to make that explicit and also explain what the relation is if it's not identity. Now, for me, there are two reasons for defending holism. The one concerns persistence over time, and the other concerns causation. So think of an organization like a university. So within a university, people come and go, but the university remains the same. So the University of Groningen, where you and I work, was founded in 1614 and has been operating ever since. Its main building burned down at the end of the 19th century, but in spite of it losing its building, the university survived. It's a really relevant example in that respect in relation to other questions that we will hopefully touch on. But you see, the university persists in spite of changes among its members. And that implies that the university cannot be reduced to a set of individuals. Now, we need some kind of explanation of that persistence, and it turns out that the theory of constitution is very well able to do that. But before I discuss that, I should turn to causation briefly. So the other idea is that, well, social entities can as such have causal consequences. Like if we increase the money supply, that can lead to inflation. It can also lead to avoiding a recession. It depends very much on the circumstances, of course. And those are all macro phenomena. So social events can cause other social events. Very briefly, now also that can be captured in terms of constitution, I argue, and constitution is the idea that an entity at a lower level, in this case the individual level, I should put it the other way around, so that a social entity can depend on an individual entity without being identical to it. And to develop that idea, I rely on a theory by Lynn Rudder Baker, who argues, well, it's the circumstances, the conditions in which the entity finds itself, that can explain why this happens. And she has this famous example of a statue and a piece of marble. So the piece of marble pre-exists the statue, because you need an artist to create the statue out of the piece of marble. And you also need a world in which things are recognized as statues, or more generally as art. So she develops this relational conception of constitution, which I think is just splendid for social reality.
Great. So no, I think you're going to use this constitution account also in further steps when we think about, for example, the social ontology of organization. So we'll turn to that later in the conversation again. But maybe now you already a few times highlighted that people have some worries when they think about the idea of holism. And so you also identify one such worry. So you say in the book that this idea or this worry persists, which states that if there are social structures that are irreducibly collective, as your constitutional holism, for example, suggests, does that then leave any room for individual autonomy? So here, holism is explicitly tied to worries about autonomy. So how does your idea of constitutional holism that you just outlined, how can it even coexist with the idea of autonomy or individual autonomy in the first place?
Exactly. So the two ways to approach this worry. The one is an actual worry about our actual organizations, that they dominate us too much and leave too little freedom for us to remain autonomous. And this is increasingly important in philosophical debates, for instance, about workplace democracy. So there it is a contingent issue, right? So it really depends on how organizations are organized, whether they provide a challenge for autonomy. And that's actually what I end up arguing. So it's really a contingent issue. We need to protect our basic liberties, but we also need to be careful in shaping organizations in a way that leaves employees free enough. But the more philosophical worry is that, like, if you have a holist theory, don't you imply that everything is caused from above? And so earlier I claimed social events can cause other social events, but the worry is that the constraints that these causal relations pose are so strict that there's no room for individuals for individual freedom anymore. Now, that view is known as collectivism. So holism is not identical with collectivism. Collectivism is the view that indeed social processes are so pervasive and so determining that they don't leave any freedom for individuals. Now, how can there be any room left for individuals? Well, the first thing to note is that causation, social causation, is a relation between social events. So I don't buy into downward causation, where um, uh, social phenomena like organizations or like the institution of marriage have downward causal effects on individuals. I don't know how to understand that even, because I think that causation is a relation between events at a level. And the second thing to note is that, yeah, if the constraints at the social level are flexible enough to leave room for individuals, then you don't have this problem anymore. And this is an idea that was made famous by Anthony Giddens, the sociologist, in his structure agency theory. So there the idea is, well, structures do constrain individuals, but individuals also shape structures. So there's a two-way connection there, and neither of them are fully determined by the others. And that idea creates space between holism and collectivism, which is why I can defend holism without buying into this idea, which was probably also on Popper's mind when he criticized holism. And people can hardly think for themselves, if at all, if social structures have these powers, so to say. And I argue that worry is premature.
Right. And so when we stick with the notion of individual autonomy in the normative realm, so to speak, perhaps somewhat surprisingly, you actually say that if we want to realize individual autonomy, that sometimes calls actually for group rights. So
Yeah.
how do we make that leap? How do we go from individual autonomy to actually
Yeah.
group rights, which might sound counterintuitive for some people?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that. That really helps me to bring across some basic ideas in my book. So I'm defending individual freedom in my book and equality between individuals, and also individual autonomy. Now, you would think that provides for a nice package where individual freedom is really tied to individual autonomy and vice versa, um, without any need for funny business like group rights or collective responsibility or whatnot. Now, I completely disagree with that. So instead, I believe that for an individual to be autonomous, of course, there's lots of basic rights that are this uniform for everybody, and freedom of speech doesn't require any special accommodations. But people also form an identity, which consists of the things that they really value, um, and to be and become and remain individual autonomous beings, they need some space to live according to their own conception of the good life. which requires, that is a very traditional idea, that you should be able to live according to your own conception of the good life. But as I fill it in, it also requires attending to the identities that people have. As long as these identities are autonomously chosen, we should accommodate them within certain limits, of course. So and why and how? Well, in many cases that doesn't really require any special effort, because people are in a liberal democracy already very free to shape their own lives in the way that they see fit. If you want to start a new club for whatever, then you can do that. It's freedom of association. However, certain identities conflicts with kind of the basic rights as they are generally conceived of. And when there is such a clash, for instance, think of halal and kosher slaughtering practices. Like these ways of slaughtering animals are prohibited in many countries. Well, maybe you need to make an exception for the people for whom these practices have special significance, because otherwise they cannot freely enjoy their freedom of religion, at least not to a full extent. So, and then you have the idea of a group right. It's a special accommodation of group identities by means of an exemption of a general rule. That's the way I spell it out in my book. So I think actually, we need to, if if you are really upset by that idea, then I can see two angles from which you might criticize it. The one is, well, social groups and minority groups and ethnic groups or religious groups or whatever groups should not play such a big role in society. That's something we can discuss, of course. But the other is also that you might not realize how social people are and how their valuations, the things that they really think are important, bear on their identity and also have an impact on how they want to play a role in society, what role they want to play. And group rights can facilitate that. So I think it's actually very important, and even more so now than some time ago. And this is because you might think, if you read the book, chapter 1, introduction, a bit of an overview, methodological commitments and all that. Chapter 2, an account of social practices, and then chapter 3, there I start discussing group rights. And you might think, that's such an old debate. Like multiculturalism is like Taylor and David Miller and lots of other people. So why bring that up again? Well, I think it's crucial to do that now, because what we see is a lot of hate against lots of social groups and a lot of kind of taken for granted liberties from a nationalist point of view, without much of any sensitivity to how this affects other groups. So defending group rights in terms of individual ideals is more important than ever.
Right. And so sticking maybe with the importance of thinking about identities. In fact, you talk about the age of identity in your book. And so here you suggest that the struggles for recognition via these identity concerns actually at least have the danger of turning into tribal wars. And here you actually start to suggest that when we start to think about these struggles for recognition regarding people's identities, then we start to see that the real enemy of the open society is not, in fact, this idea of holism, this metaphysical idea of holism, but it is actually tribalism. So maybe you could slightly elaborate on how you make that move.
Yeah. So for Popper, the enemy of the open society was tribalism, but he equated it with holism. So the kind of philosophical idea that supported tribalism. Now, I do two things. The first is, as you mentioned, I tease them apart. So for me, tribalism is still the enemy, but holism is not, because I argue you actually need supporting social structures in order to guarantee our basic liberties. So even a liberal democracy requires holist structures. Now, the other step I take is, let's take a closer look at identity. And this is new, I think. Not talk of identity, of course, but in relation to open society, if you look at Popper, he doesn't mention it, and that's very understandable, because he was he wrote his book during the Second World War, so he had totalitarianism in mind as an enemy, and that's look at Nazism and fascism in Italy. What you see there is tribalism. So identity and tribal attitudes and practices were also very closely related for him. Now, I think it's also important to tease that apart. So everybody has an identity, even a libertarian has an identity, right? No matter how free and anarchist and how detached from social structures you are or want to be or would like to be, you have some identity, because it's at its core, that's just the idea that there are certain things that matter for you, not only in terms of how you think, but also in terms of what you do. So it can be just silly practices as to when you have dinner, like in Southern Europe, it's much later than here up in the Netherlands. But it can also be, your religious identity, your national identity, and all that. Now, I think it's crucial in this age of identity to develop a conception that fits with a liberal society. So why do I call it the age of identity? Well, I was struck by that, because I thought the politics of identity, that was with Charles Taylor, right? His paper on the politics of recognition and all that, and maybe even earlier than that. But over the past few years, I've come to realize, it has only become worse. And worse? In principle, attention for identity is great. We need to attend to each other's identities and be sensitive to them and think about what they are. But what you see nowadays is that, on the one hand, there's more and more sensitivity from a philosophical perspective, that identities are just socially constructed. People adopt them and they form them and they can be changed. Whereas a lot of people in practice have become essentialists about them. They think their identity is really essential to who they are, in a way that the whole philosophical literature on social construction was meant to debunk.
Right.
So, and if it is so essential to who you are not. That is dangerous for instance, for a tolerant attitude, and also for an inclusive attitude sometimes. And those things are important for the open society. So I think a new perspective on identity and how it relates to liberal democracy is a crucial feature of an adequate conception of the open society nowadays.
Right. And so that's a really interesting observation. And I guess also in the book, to counter this kind of essentialism in practice, you do already make some remarks, right, about how to potentially overcome that. So you point to the idea of an open mentality in relation to a liberal ethos, I suppose. And it is those elements that can maybe help us navigate at least these conflicts. So maybe you can briefly comment on that.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's useful to mention Rawls again, because he argues that a liberal society and a just society consists of just structures. Now, Jerry Cohen has already argued, well, you need more than that. You need people commit to certain ideals. What he calls people have to embrace an egalitarian ethos. Now, inspired by this idea, I developed the notion of an open mentality. And there the claim is, at least some of us need to embrace ideals like toleration, epistemic modesty, and inclusivity. And I say some of us because I don't think you can impress this on an entire society. That would be futile and probably also not very liberal to require that. However, I do think that you need a substantial group of people who are very committed to these ideals if you are to uphold a liberal democracy. Otherwise, it is too fragile.
Right. Right. And so when we return, I guess, to the idea of these building blocks of society, so we already talked about social practices, social groups, social structures. And so now let us introduce also the term institutions. So how does that fit into this picture of these different building blocks of society? So yeah, how do we think about this notion?
Yeah, so maybe I should start with the social structure because I haven't really explained what I mean by that. So social practice is consists of an activity that a bunch of people perform on a regular basis, and this can really be basic things like going for lunch at noon or at 1 or whenever. That can be rule governed in terms of signals, for instance, but the extra step that you need in order to arrive at institutions is a normative dimension. And most social practices do have a normative dimension. But what I have, you might think, well, certain ways of doing something are expected and are appreciated, or certain ways of doing it are seen as excellent, like giving a lecture or something. You might have all kinds of standards there, and that is all part. That can all be part of a social practice. But what I add to that in order to arrive at institutions is a norm. So the claim is that institutions are social practices that are governed by a social norm. And here the idea is that the social norm tells you what to do in the context of that institution. And it can be really, it can be grandiose, like are really clearly significant. Within a marriage, you have certain obligations and rights. As a citizen, you have certain obligations and rights. You can, and they really matter to what you can do and who you are. But they can also be more basic. Think, for instance, of someone who wears a ring, a wedding ring. Now that is a signal, right? And at least on one interpretation of it, it kind of means, look, I am married, and I'm not interested in being approached to be flirted with or to be propositioned or whatever. Yeah, similarly for a citizen who wants to travel abroad, you need a passport, and that passport is a permission to travel abroad under certain conditions, of course. So in all these examples, you see that permissions and obligations and prohibitions matter, and that's what distinguishes institutions from social practices.
Right. And so your specific approach that you outline in the book in terms of institutions is a form of functionalism. And so here you actually distinguish between two different kinds of functions, I suppose. So you have institutions, its etiological function and its teleological function. So maybe could you outline this distinction, like what it entails, and how does functionalism help in general with thinking about institutions?
Yeah, so just as social practices, institutions entail regularities of behavior, and people develop habits, or they have the right incentives to behave in similar ways in similar situations. For instance, yeah, I find traffic always a very illuminating example. But yeah, the examples can become a bit tedious, like driving on the right hand side of the road or stopping for a red light. But there are lots of others, including marriage, or like even how people behave in parliament. And as a chairperson, and just yeah, certain time allotted to people to speak, and all that has a normative dimension. Now you can ask many questions about institutions to begin with. What are they, but also what explains this behavior. But the functionalist question is, what explains why they persist over time? So it seems that institutions are self-reinforcing, and because of how we behave, we tend to behave more and more like that, also later at a later point in time. That's when you start asking that question about persistence, you turn to the question about the function of institutions, at least how I approach it. Now, at this point, we're talking about etiological functions. They are the ones that are explanatory, and they are concerned with persistence over time. Now, and this is where the equilibrium notion is also really crucial, because the notion of equilibrium can explain why institutions are self-reinforcing in terms of the existing regularities of behavior and the expectations and the preferences. This is already, this goes back to David Lewis' theory of conventions, which explained these notions. He didn't defend functionalism, but Edna Ullmann Margulies did. And in that tradition, I do so as well. So institutions can indeed persist over time, and an adequate explanation of how, for instance, what kind of feedback loop explains that is then a functionalist explanation. Now, there's one big problem with explanations like that, in the social sciences at least. They suggest that we live in the best world possible. This is a criticism you often hear, like functionalism is bad because there are many bad institutions. We know that many institutions are harmful or oppressive, or unjust, and in order to do justice to that, we should reject functionalism. I think that is too quick, and to make that point, I distinguish these two kinds of functionalism, and I say, well, we can actually retain etiological functionalism without implying that we live in the best possible world. So the idea there is that even oppressive institutions can sometimes be explained, or the persistence of those institutions can be explained in terms of our preferences and expectations. And then people might come back and criticize this because, what are you saying? Because people who are oppressed don't like that, so don't you think their preferences are different? Well, they are stuck in a situation often. And in that situation, they often don't have a better option than to go along with that institution. If you're in a patriarchal society as a woman and you're being oppressed as a woman, within a marriage, for instance, where there's no room for you to have a job or to go out of the house or whatnot. It's easy to say, well, but any woman will reject that. But in a patriarchal society, that requires at least giving up on certain ideals, certain things you really want and value, like a relationship, and perhaps also having children, because in such societies, it's difficult, if not impossible, to have children on your own. And the other thing as well, it might even require political action, social activism. And I'm all in favor of social activism, but not everybody is up for it. So it's really important to understand why even harmful and oppressive practice in institutions can persist. Now, the other kind of functionalism, teleological functionalism, comes in order to indicate, well, we do have all kinds of ideals, we do subscribe to values, and we want to realize them in a social setting. But I start from the idea that a teleological function is really something that is in principle attributed from the outside, at least when we're talking about institutions. So, and the way they actually function has a certain priority in terms of explanation. So if we want to evaluate them, then we can turn to teleology and consider the purpose or the ideal or the value that we want to be realized in a certain context. And next step is to try and use those ideals and values for the purpose of design or for re-engineering to use a Popperian term. So there's lots of room for ideals and values, but we also have to be careful in thinking about how they relate to how things actually work. And that can coincide. Of course, there are institutions that really promote the values that we attribute to them, but it's certainly not always the case.
Right. And so when we take this idea of teleological function and we try to approach things from the design stance, so to speak, one may think that it is ultimately the state that is responsible for making sure that we end up with just institutions. But you in the book indicate, right, that we should think beyond just the state in terms of how we can uphold just institutions. Citizens also play a role there. And there we start to approach topics in terms of issues of collective responsibility. So
Yeah.
how do we spell that out?
Yeah, so in a big part of the book, I rely on a Rawlsian framework. So I go along with the idea that justice is the first responsibility for the state. But indeed, I go on to argue that it's not only the responsibility of the state, for two reasons. The first is, well, if you want to have a thriving liberal democracy, a significant number of people have to be openly committed to the ideals of that society, including ideals about justice, because that's the only way in which these institutions are going to work and remain stable over time. And the other thing to note is that in practice, there's no society that is fully just. And then you can say, well, okay, if there's a deficiency in our society, then the government should fix it. Well, that is too easy. First of all, governments rarely do anything without support and pressure of their citizens, or except for the ones that are really corrupt, of course. So you need to incentivize them. So there is already some collective responsibility from the citizens. So because it's not going to work if you only do it by yourself. So it's really something that we should do, even if the individuals do it to some extent separately. But there needs to be pressure. Like an American example would be everybody can write a letter to their congressperson. But ultimately, it's often a matter of activism. You need to take social action or collective action. So then it is important to, if you want to achieve change in a society, to work together, to motivate each other, to inform each other that you're willing to join in, and then actually take action. So, so this collective responsibility, how demanding it is, depends on the kind of society you're in. In some societies, it's mainly you should vote and you should let yourself hear it. If you want something, maybe go to a demonstration. But in others, it may be much more encompassing. So in that sense, they also deviate from Rawls, at least in practice. So Rawls introduces this distinction between ideal theory and non-ideal theory. And I use that in the sense that I defend, I consider some ideal theory, but a lot of the book is about non-ideal theory, about structural injustice, for instance. But in a way that fits Rawls' framework for thinking about those things, right? There's lots of non-ideal theorists that do non-ideal theory in opposition to Rawls, but I'm not so sure why that should be the case.
Right. And so at this point in the book, you move from institutions to organizations and specifically to the idea of collective agents, so organizations as collective agents. So while for many people it's of course familiar to think of individual humans as entities possessing agency, the idea of collective agency is perhaps less familiar. But you argue that organizations aren't just collections of individuals possessing agency, they're agents in their own right, capable of making and enacting decisions from a rational point of view, their rational point of view. So how should we wrap our heads around this idea and this transformation? And how does it also extend your approach from social practice and institutions to the realm of organizations?
Yeah. Maybe I should start with the second part of your question. So organizations, what are they? Well, there's many different theories, of course, but they seem to involve lots of social practices and institutions. So they have different ways of doing things. They they have a division of roles that specifies who should do what and everything, and that itself can be seen as an institution. So one perspective on organizations is that it is a cluster of social structures. Now, actually, I define a society as a cluster of social structures. So we need to be a bit more precise. So an organization is a cluster of social structures, but those social structures are in particular three important ones. So there's a collective decision procedure. So there the idea is that within an organization, there's a bunch of people who influence what decisions are made by the organization. And there's a procedure, there's a fixed way of doing it. I mean, it can be flexible, but there are certain parameters that constrain that process. And as I mentioned, there are also there's a system of roles that divides the labor between people, and it helps them to enact these decisions of the organization. Now, the third constitutive rule, as I call it, is a membership rule, and that determines who is a member of an organization, and perhaps also who can become a member of an organization, and which roles do they occupy. Now, that implies a few things. The first is the membership rule makes it quite determinate who belongs to the organization and who doesn't. So it is much more unified in that respect than a random social practice like celebrating a national holiday or something. And the second thing is that the other two main rules, the collective decision procedure and the system of roles, target decision making and action. So an organization consists of a bunch of individuals who do things that are geared towards making decisions of an organization, I want to say, and enacting those decisions. Now, at this point, individualists will still say, yeah, but all that talk can be reduced to individuals. But what I say instead is, well, look, this talk about organizations as agents that decide things and that do things is supported by this analysis of structures, and it also supports two further things. One is organizations can persist over time, even if their members change, and the other is, well, look, we now have a framework for explaining how organizations can have causal effects at the social level. So these are the arguments from persistence and the argument from causation that I use throughout the book in order to defend holism, non-reductive view. And by that time, it has just become very attractive to think of organizations as agents. Now, what you added to that in your question, actually, you mentioned that they have a rational point of view. Now, that's what I introduced, inspired by many others like Philip Pettit and Carol Rouvain, in order to indicate how they actually can be sensitive to constraints of rationality that are part of being an agent. So they can try and make consistent decisions over time. They can keep in mind, whether their beliefs are coherent, whether they are sensitive enough to observations and all that. And whether the actions that they decide on realize their preferences and their goals. So at that point, there's a theoretical construction that makes sense of organizations as agents. And then there's not so much reason to shy away from actually embracing that. And there is an important reason for accepting it, which is when we start thinking about what the role of organizations is in society and what kind of responsibility and rights they might have.
Right. So before we do that, before we try to connect these issues of collective agency with issues of corporate responsibility and the normative moral universe that we inhabit, let me just briefly also raise the following question, which has to do with thinking about organizations, but then particular metaphysical issues that arise when we think about organizations that have a particular institutional or legal status. So earlier, you already touched upon the institution, namely the university. And so here you talk about the location problem, and this is inspired by the philosopher Gilbert Ryle, and he raises the following question. A visitor sees all the colleges, libraries, and departments at Oxford or Cambridge, and consequently asks the question, but where is the university? So how are we to think about this question, and what kind of challenge does it poses for questions having to do with social ontology?
Yeah, that's a lovely passage in Gilbert Ryle. He imagines hosting a visitor and showing him all the colleges and everything, and then indeed the tourist asks, or the visitor asks, like, "But where is the university?" And this is a kind of a joke, right? And then Ryle goes on to say, well, he has already seen all the parts of the university. And there is no further question of where the university is. But Ryle also argues, well, the visitor makes a category mistake. And that is at least a hint towards the idea that there are two levels here. And Ryle also says, well, the university is how all those things are organized. So the whole example and question and joke, if you want, point towards the idea that there are different levels and how we should explain that. Now, it has led, however, to all kinds of questions that can be seen as metaphysical puzzles. So David Hillel Rubin, in his book on the metaphysics of the social world in 1985, a wonderful book, he imagines that the Red Cross has some people entering Albania, and then he asks, is the Red Cross in Albania? Now, the Red Cross didn't have a headquarter in Albania at that time. So he ends up answering no, if I recall that correctly, actually. But then the puzzle is, this is organization that has headquarters, and there are people, and they can be at different locations. Even the University of Oxford, it could close down during summer or during Corona or whatever, such that none of the employees, none of the members of the universities, I should say, is in Oxford. But the university is still in Oxford. So how can that be? Now, at that point, some people start saying, well, yeah, well, what is in Oxford? The buildings are still in Oxford, so maybe the university consists to a large extent of its buildings. And I find that a kind of a desperate move because, the university owns its buildings. It cannot be equated with its buildings. I mean, I own a building, a house, but it's not part of me. Why would that be different in the case of a university? So there's this location puzzle or location problem in social ontology, as I have dubbed it. And it presses further onto the issue of how does the social relate to the individual. And my alternative take on it is to say, well, we have to keep in mind that organizations can be understood in two different ways. One is as collective agents, as I've just explained, and the other is as collective agents with an institutional status. And like my book club, I'm a member of a book club with some friends going back to uni. The time I was there studying, and so when we come together, we do that on a regular basis, and we form a collective agent of sorts. We have all kinds of practices and of decision making and of acting and all that, and we persist over time. But we don't have an institutional status, and we are not registered anywhere. Apart from us, there are only a few friends that know of its existence, so an institutional agent can be a government agency or a business that is accredited with the Chamber of Commerce. And that's an additional layer, so to say, on top of collective agency. And such institutional agents also have institutional locations. If you register a business at a Chamber of Commerce, you have to indicate an address. Usually that's just your own address, where it needs to be an address where they can send mail to. Now, let's go back to Oxford, this example. So the idea was that the university might be in Oxford, even though none of its members are. Well, one response was, well, then what's still in Oxford are the buildings. So the university can be equated with the buildings. I criticized that already. And an alternative say, well, the reason why we keep going back to Oxford as the location of this university, and the buildings may play a role in it, but it's really that is where it is registered. It's acknowledged by the government as a university in Oxford. And it's, I think actually Oxford University is a charity. So the charity is registered in Oxford. And that explains away the entire puzzle. So I find it a rather convincing solution. But I know that others disagree, so there are many other complex issues involved. But this is at least one way in which, we can deal with it.
So treating the location problem as solved, at least for our purposes now. So let us return to the issue of collective agents. So here again, there's this worry that if we accept this idea that there are these irreducible collective agents with their own rational point of view, then we end up with a form of collectivism that could undermine individual autonomy, an issue we raised earlier in our conversation as well. And so here Popper, for example, critiqued Rousseau's idea of the general will, which some people might be familiar with. You yourself actually spelled this out, or at least characterized this problem as the corporate autonomy problem. Namely, if organizations are irreducibly collective, they could be autonomous and claim the same basic rights as humans. So could you maybe provide some more substance to this problem, and then what's your way to approach and deal with this problem?
Yeah, I think it's actually a slightly different problem from the one that you describe. So I distinguish between the individual autonomy problem and the collective autonomy problem. And the individual autonomy problem is really the problem of how social structures can constrain individuals such that they cannot be autonomous. And that can apply to institutions, but also to collective agents. And that's a genuine worry, but as I argued, it's a contingent problem. You can solve it by creating organizations that are suitably accommodating to individuals. Now, the corporate autonomy problem is really about collective agents and the kind of agents that they are. So I argue that they are agents, and as we just discussed. And then I go on to consider the question: are they also moral agents? So, they have a rational point of view, but do they also have a moral point of view? And I actually argue that they do, but that gives rise to further philosophical puzzles. So, on the one hand, it's wonderful when I and other philosophers are able to construct intelligible theories of organizations as collective agents, as moral agents, and it fits with the way we treat them often. For instance, when we hold them responsible for certain disasters. So, but there's a deeper puzzle at that point, and that is okay. But if collective agents are moral agents, if they can even become autonomous, then it seems like they have the same kind of moral standing as human beings. And they are moral persons. Now that is striking, and it is certainly in tension with liberalism, with the ideal of liberal democracy. Well, why? Well, at the heart of liberalism lies this notion of normative individualism. So the claim is that only human beings are moral persons, and only they are entitled to basic rights. So many liberals are also committed to ontological holism or to methodological holism. Sorry, individualism. And I criticize all that, and I defend ontological holism and methodological holism. But this last commitment of liberalism, normative individualism, if you let go of that, then you basically reject liberalism. So I had to think carefully about this, and it took a long time for me to figure out how to respond to this, because it seemed that my argument just entailed that collective agents can be autonomous agents and moral persons. They don't have to be, right? There can be exceptions. It's an empirical question whether they are. But yeah, if they are moral persons, then normative individualism has to be rejected, and we should grant collective agents all kinds of moral rights. Now, at this point, some people say, well, but collective agents and organizations have all kinds of rights. Yeah, but maybe they are just legal rights and not moral rights. So and they don't have all rights, right? So consider the right to vote. Should organizations now have the right to vote? Should they have freedom of religion? Well, the U.S. Supreme Court actually thinks that some of them do. And should they have political freedom? Again, with super PACs and the legislation in the US. But all those things are very controversial, and perhaps we shouldn't go there. So they might undermine the idea that human beings are unique in a way that is just very similar, different for organizations.
Right. And so before we maybe dive more into how you actually overcome this kind of issue in terms of whether we have this kind of symmetry or how we can introduce an asymmetry between individual agents and collective agents, maybe we can take a small detour and think about how do collective agents as moral agents actually enter into sort of our picture of the moral universe. So some people have tried to motivate this kind of picture by talking about the idea of a responsibility gap. So they might, for example, say, well, a gap exists if a collective does something for which blame is fitting, even though no individual or no one can be blamed for it, then there's sort of a gap that we might have to fill. And by introducing collective agents as moral agents, we might be able to fill this gap, so to speak, by claiming that those responsibilities actually fall on the collective as a irreducible moral agent. You think this is not the right way to think about collective agents and corporate responsibility and how they fit into our broader picture of the moral universe? So maybe you could say what's wrong with setting up our account of the moral universe and the role of collective agents in it in this way, and what's an alternative way to maybe set it up differently where we don't need to appeal to the idea of responsibility gaps?
Yeah, responsibility gaps have been discussed both in relation to organizations and to AI, actually. Like self-driving cars might be susceptible to responsibility gaps. And the idea is indeed that there is like a remainder. When there's an accident, then we want to attribute a certain amount of blame. And we look at organizations or at self-driving cars. The self-driving car is a really nice example because there is no one to blame. It's driving itself. And it seems silly to actually blame the self-driving car because it's not a moral agent. So there seems to be obvious reason to attribute blame, but no one to attribute it to. Now, in the organization, this is often very different. If the organization is a collective of moral agents, you can just blame the organization. But it still raises questions when the members cannot be blamed. And this is sometimes the case. Perhaps they didn't have the resources they needed or the information they needed, or perhaps they were sick at home, so they cannot be blamed. And there's still this sense that the organization can be blamed. So let's just blame the organization as such and thereby close the gap. Now, I think this way of approaching it is flawed. And we can see it in the case of the self-driving car, because there, what you will want to do is to ask questions like, who made this car? Who programmed it? Who tested it? Who admitted it on the road? And all these people, or actually institutions often, can be blamed. Like if there is car with a substantial defect already, even if it's not self-driving, we expect the manufacturer to recall it. So they are to blame, right? It's completely embedded in our practices. Now the organization, and that suggests that there is no responsibility gap, because we can attribute blame to the responsible people. What there might be is that there's kind of a control gap, that the self-driving car isn't able enough to make good decisions, especially like moral evaluations and morally informed choices. And so I think the situation with respect to organizations is rather similar. So if the members are excused, then perhaps there just is no blame to go around. So sometimes we should just excuse the organization as well. Now, I do allow for the possibility that the organization can be blamed, but none of its members.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not a gap. That just reflects on how whether and how responsibility can be distributed from the organization to its members. But the underlying issue is whether the organization is organized in a way such that it can systematically do what it should do.
Right.
And if that's not the case, then there is a control gap. So we should start from this forward-looking perspective, whether organizations have suitable control over their actions and can actually fulfill their moral responsibilities. And then the next question after an event, a disaster or an accident happens, then we can think about backward-looking responsibility. But that rule is simply, well, if someone is excused, they are excused. There's no gap to be filled.
Got it. Okay. So in that sense, it's symmetrical in terms of, in both cases, the issue is control. And in both cases, similar practices of responsibility ascription proceed. And in that sense, the case of corporate collective agents is not very distinct in terms of how we should introduce responsibility, so to speak, into those practices.
Yes, absolutely. The main difference is that the organization is responsible for its own control, so to say, and a self-driving car has to be programmed by others.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a major difference. But in other respects, they are parallel.
Okay, so earlier you mentioned, right, the potential tension that people see in terms of upholding the idea of normative individualism when we are committed to the idea of ontological holism. But in the end, you think actually normative individualism can be saved. And then you do this via what you term the argument from recognition. So how do you do this?
Yeah. So in the end, I argue that collective agents can be moral agents, but not moral persons. And to make that point, I again go back to John Rawls, who discusses the role of self-esteem and self-respect in moral personhood. So he claims that moral personhood, and it's also part of autonomy, comes with self-respect and self-esteem, at least the potential, and you have to have to a fair amount. Now, that also means that for collective agents to not only be a moral agent, but also a moral person, it needs to be autonomous, and that then includes self-respect and self-esteem. And so what is the connection with recognition? Well, recognition consists of esteem and respect. And you need esteem and respect in order to develop and acquire self-esteem and respect. So let me, and this is important for a number of reasons. One is this was all already in Rawls. So a lot of the talk of recognition has added new things, but the basic idea that recognition is important for moral personhood was already there, and that I use to argue that collective agents cannot be moral persons. Why not? Well, you might respect them and have esteem for them. I cannot, and that could happen, that someone has those attitudes towards organizations, but they don't have any feelings. So there's no way in which they can translate this into self-esteem and self-respect. So it is really, in the end, the fact that collective agents are not conscious, cannot feel pain and cannot have feelings. And this is, lots of philosophers already invoke the lack of phenomenal consciousness as a reason to argue against corporate moral personhood. But I've always been dissatisfied with the arguments because they just seem to postulate, well, look, if you don't have phenomenal consciousness, you cannot be a moral person, or you cannot be autonomous. But when it comes to autonomy, it seems actually you can be a moral. So what is they don't explain what the connection is between autonomy and recognition, as I say it, or just phenomenal consciousness and self-respect and self-esteem. So it was only once I went back to Rawls that I realized, okay, but this is a way to explain why that is the case. And that then means that collective agents cannot be moral persons, and that saves the normative individualism thesis, because that thesis says only human beings can be moral persons.
Right. So with that reconciliation, let us move to the final bit in your book. So you close your book by emphasizing the need for a balance between community and individuality. Enough cohesion to connect, as you say, but enough space to disagree without being ostracized, loyalty to ideals over just local ties, etc. So what would you say are your final words on achieving this balance in today's polarized world?
Yeah. So for a long time, communitarians were the main critics of liberalism. And they argued liberalism is too individualistic. And it's really damaging for society because people need a sense of belonging. They need a community to flourish. And I wholeheartedly agree. So the idea was that they didn't reject liberalism. The claim was liberalism needs a communitarian correction. Now, I think we now live in very different times. Perhaps in some respects, our societies are still too individualistic, but in others, they have become too much. The role of social groups and communities has become too large. And this brings us back to what we started with, like polarization and fragmentation. So polarization is often between groups and communities that are very tight-knit internally. But they are also they can be very aggressive even to each other. So I think that communities that have ties that are so strong that they are really not willing to get along with other groups are a problem for our society. They're also a problem internally for all the familiar reasons, because they might oppress some of their members as well. The example that I often use is a gay person in a Christian community. The slogan that's often used is "You can be gay, but you cannot do gay." Well, that is a kind of oppression. I would say you're disallowed from living according to your identity. But the problem now is even more between communities, that people, there's the tribalism, as Popper calls it, that the tribe is everything and the individual is nothing. That is not healthy. It's not good for individuals. They might lose their autonomy, but it's also really bad for society. So how to solve that? Well, I advocate the open mentality, and I claim that people need to be modest, epistemically modest, so need to be aware of the fact that they themselves can be mistaken, tolerate other people, which means that even if they disagree very strongly, they should still respect the other. And they should have embraced some ideal of inclusivity, where diversity is seen in principle as a good thing. Now, is it going to solve the problems? Maybe I should have left it right there, because then I could pretend as a grand philosopher to have solved the problems of contemporary society. Just go out and adopt open mentality, or preach it. Well, not preach it, but inspire people to adopt it. Yeah, I wish it were so. Of course, this is something I would applaud, and something that I'm doing in part by my book. But it's a real question whether, it has already become dark enough, and whether our societies have become too closed already for us to return to the open society. And that is, something that I hope to keep exploring. But more needs to be done there. The open mentality is a great idea. It's a revival of ideas by Popper, and I try to make them more relevant to today, in particular by thinking about the role of identity. But it's not a ready-made solution. It's just the start of it.
Right. Now, lots more to be done. So, Frank, thanks for those last closing words. And thanks a lot of course, also for this entire conversation. For people interested in diving more into these topics, read the book, The Structure of the Open Society, Social Ontology Meet Collective Ethics. I'll also link the book in the YouTube description. So, Frank, thanks again for coming on the podcast. It's been a pleasure, as always.
Thanks for having me. It was indeed a pleasure, as always. Absolutely.